Welcome to episode 85 of The Route. The Route is a glorified sports business coffee chat that takes a new guest each week and they share their experiences and route in sports. I'm Christopher Nascimento, and let's get started. As usual, there's just two things to cover before we get into today's guest. So, firstly, if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. Actually, that's down here. That's afterwards. But yeah, so we're on all major podcasting platforms, including YouTube, where you can watch us via video. And if you haven't already, follow, subscribe, rate 5 stars, or like the video, as it allows the podcast to become more easily discoverable. Just take some time to do that. Thank you. And then with that as well, as I was pointing up here, you can see it says at The Route Sports. So we're on all social media platforms. Follow us there, especially LinkedIn. That's a great one, especially considering the audience and the topics we're covering. That's where a lot of you are. So check us out there at The Route Sports on all platforms. And with that said, let's get into today's introduction of our guest. So I'd now like to introduce someone who has worked for top companies like the COC, Red Bull, Adidas, Canada Rugby, Momentum, MLSE, and now the head of sports at Twitter Canada, Conor Clarance. Welcome to the Route. How's it going?
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for joining. The way I like to start every single podcast, pretty simple. It's in the name of the episode or the podcast. Take us through your route. So where did you go to school and how did you get here today?
Amazing. I don't think I've had the COC been a part of like that resume introduction in a long time. That was 2010 Vancouver Olympics. I got to be a brand ambassador, or running around Whistler, giving people temporary tattoos, getting people to sing out Canada and stuff like that. So it's always an interesting part of my career journey to remember, because it's kind of like where it all started, where you got this realization that a career in sports is somewhat possible. But I do remember at the time, I think the person who ever ordered the uniforms, I ended up with like an XL pair of pants and they were very large. So that's probably one of my standing memories, other than, of course, getting to celebrate Alex Bilodeau's gold as the first Canadian gold medal on home soil. But thanks so much. Yeah. So my career journey, I went to UBC, did a degree in marketing and international business. As a part of that degree, you actually are forced to go on exchange because of the international business portion of it. And I was really excited about that. So I actually went to Hong Kong and spent about 7 months there, 4 months as a student at HKUST, and then 3 months working working for an asset management firm back when I thought I wanted to go into finance. Came back to UBC, started working for Red Bull, of all places, as a student brand manager for UBC. Was at UBC for another year there, and actually went on exchange to Taiwan and got an opportunity to work for Red Bull in Taiwan. Again, in a sort of student brand manager capacity, but at the time, the office in Taiwan was only about 7 people. So it was a really unique experience, just because Red Bull Canada was this sort of really well-known, built-up entity at the time, and Red Bull Taiwan was just in its early stages as an office. So it really developed, and kind of got to volunteer my time out there working with the country sports manager, the field marketing specialist, et cetera, and get a little bit more exposure to stuff that I wouldn't have gotten exposure to in Canada, just out of they needed people to do stuff. And I was sort of happy to volunteer my time to do so. So got an opportunity to work for Red Bull in Taiwan, then came back, finished my degree at UBC, and moved on to a full-time role with Red Bull as an event vehicle specialist, which is a really, really fun role. You get to drive around. My territory was Western Canada, so everywhere from Victoria all the way to Winnipeg, driving around in a big black truck called Suga, which is a massive vehicle with TVs, a DJ booth, all this stuff. So you would essentially be a party in a car that you got to bring around to different events, different sort of, whether it's sports, entertainment, et cetera. All of the players within the Red Bull community. And after a summer of that and in a contract role, I actually made my way over to Germany to work for Adidas. I was a huge sneakerhead growing up, loved it with a passion, and had an opportunity to go work for Adidas in Herzogenaurach, living in Nuremberg, which was a hugely valuable, exciting experience. Got to work on what at the time was called My Coach, now sort of falls under their digital sports banner. But when you think about the early versions of like a Runtastic, that's sort of what became of the My Coach team after my time there. So how do we bring analytics into sports in the early days? And after a short-term contract there, I absolutely loved Adidas, but I think in my early 20s, living in small town Germany was sort of a little bit at odds with what I wanted to do. So I came back to Canada and eventually made my way to Toronto working for Rugby Canada. And rugby was a big part of my life. I actually went to a high school on Vancouver Island that was pretty big into rugby. I played it all throughout my university career. And so getting to work for an organization that was sort of near and dear to my heart was hugely beneficial. Got to do a bunch of marketing as we led into the 2015 Rugby World Cup, which was really, really exciting. Obviously, getting to know a bunch of the players on the team who I had either played with or knew of through sort of like the rugby community, because it's pretty tight knit. And then after some time with Rugby Canada, I moved over to an agency called McCann or Momentum, depending on how you look at them. They sort of all sit within the same holding company. But I worked on the MasterCard business with primarily, also touching Bell, a couple of the General Motors brands, et cetera. But mostly that MasterCard MLSE relationship was probably the thing that was consistent throughout my 3.5 years at McCann. And I basically got to help them activate their sponsorship rights with MLSE, Cirque du Soleil, the Canadiens, the MasterCard Memorial Cup at the time, with the Canadian Hockey League. So lots of really exciting exposure with a really sort of forward-thinking brand in MasterCard, amongst some great work with Bell, some great work with GMC and the GM brands as well. And then luckily enough, after having 3.5 years of working really well with MLSE, I got an opportunity to actually go work on the MLSE side of the coin, again in a partnerships role. So get to work with a few great brands, nonetheless, of Canadian Tire, Budweiser, Google, Ford, and the list probably goes on and on and on. So getting to work across all 4 of the major teams, and then across the grassroots initiatives that made a difference and mattered, which was hugely powerful thing. And then also got to work for a sports team on the day sports stop, which is a really, I think, iconic day in my career, getting to walk into that office. I think it was like March 12th or whatever, the day after the NBA stopped. And you're like, I have no idea what today's going to bring. I have no idea what's going to happen. And everyone was sort of running like a chicken with their head cut off, because there was all this unknown and rumors flying left and right, and what was all going to happen. And then actually a couple of weeks later transitioned over to Twitter, which is where I'm currently at, getting to work on our sports partnerships team. So in my current role, I get to manage our relationships with Canada's sort of biggest broadcasters, teams, leagues, and to a lesser extent, but to an important extent, make sure that athletes have a healthy and safe place to sort of join the conversation on Twitter. And that's what I get to do now. And it's an amazing job. I work with an amazing team, amazing group of people, and I've sort of seen my career slowly make its way to this construction of, or intersection, I should say, of technology and sports, which is where it's at now. And now I get to sort of do that every day, which is a major blessing.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing route, right? It's jam packed with a bunch of experience and so much to dive into, right, for this episode. That's unreal. So one of the first things I'd like to do is I usually go back and kind of go through the flow of it, but something I've noticed in the last few episodes, and even in regards to myself, I started off in accounting, then I went to marketing, and then even yesterday when I was recording, episode 84, same type of thing where in school, people start off with one degree and then they switch over. So what was the reasoning for you to go from finance to marketing? Did you have maybe light bulb go off?
That's a great question. That's quite literally, I have what I call my light bulb moment, and it's probably one of the stories that I'm like the most open about, because I think, especially the university sort of system, rightly or wrongly, really promotes the sort of traditional safe or traditional, this is how you can make money coming out of school routes. And they're not bad. I've got a bunch of great friends that are in both of these routes. But I actually thought I was going to go into finance. I thought I was going to go into sales and trading, of all things. And there's a lot of reasons there. My mom's in finance. All my friends were in finance. So it kind of made sense to naturally gravitate towards that. When I was in Taiwan, I was, if you remember, working for Red Bull at the time. I actually flew back from Taiwan to Canada for an interview with a major bank here in Canada for a sales and trading investment banking rotational program. So you get this job, you're set. Your next 3 years, money's going to be good. You're going to get an opportunity to get exposure to all the different areas of the bank, get a ton of different ability to sort of grow your career. And this is like exactly what I thought I wanted. Anyways, I go into the interview. I've flown back like probably 30 hours of traveling both ways. And I completely bombed the interview. I've never had as bad of an interview as I had in that interview. And it's kind of like 10 minutes into the interview, I was doing fine, but I kind of realized, I was like, this isn't what I wanted to do. I was doing some really cool, fun work with Red Bull at the time, really impactful, sort of like that uplifting soul work. And I realized that it was just like, this is great, but it's not for me. This isn't what I want to do. And I sort of, at that moment, I was like, yeah, it would be nice to make a lot of money in my life, and it would be nice to have all the things that like a career in finance could give me. But this side, I felt like for me and who I am, getting that passion piece of being able to work in an industry I cared about, getting to work for all those reasons we wake up in the morning, I could find that with sports. And I really found that with Red Bull. And so, rightly or wrongly, it sort of put me in that direction. And I would say rightly at this point, but there's definitely, I think, anyone who's had their early career in sports, you're going to have your moments where you're like, is this the right move? But at least I think now it's worked out.
Yeah, that's a funny story, because even like similar for me in regards to accounting, there's like the light bulb moment where, I was actually working at TD Place just, as a part-time staff while in university, and probably similar to, where you realize, oh, there could be a career in sports when you're at the COC. Sure. And then I was like, oh, I got to get a real big boy job, get that on my resume, accounting. So I went to go do an accounting job, and then I was doing fine, didn't really enjoy it. And then I guess I was doing well, where they're like, hey, Chris, if you want, we'll give you a full-time position. And once you graduate, you'll be making like this. So, and then for some reason, like as soon as they said that, my parents were on vacation and I was home alone. And then I called them like, hey, I'm quitting and I'm switching programs. And that was my light bulb moment. I'm like, I don't care how much they put in front of me. I can't do another day of this. And then it was kind of a weird moment. Like I know I'll be happy doing sports, and I kind of just fully transitioned into marketing. So it's funny that you just had that light bulb moment after flying home for 30 hours and then having an interview like that, and that was the moment that just clicked. So that's pretty interesting. And then I guess once you kind of had that light bulb go off, and you're saying, hey, like I actually felt more meaningful and uplifting work when I was at Red Bull. How did that kind of continue on from there? So what kind of things did you change once you had that light bulb go off?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think I was inherently very, very lucky in terms of my early career, in terms of the connections I was able to make, and sort of the help that I got for mentors and things like that, because that really shaped what doors opened for sort of like myself and my career journey. I don't know that I functionally thought about it really in my early career. I was still I think at that point, a fourth year university student. Graduating in 4 years is leaving the party at 10, I always say. So I did 5 years. And it was a really great decision. I always look fondly back on it. But yeah, I sort of kept trying to find the types of organizations. I think that's one of the things that we struggle with if you want to work in sports is, what are the organizations I can actually work for in the market that I'm actually interested in working for? Like, I knew I really wanted to work for Adidas, but like they have like 6 or 7 roles that are outside of sort of retail roles in Vancouver. So that would either mean a move to Europe, a move to Portland, a move to Toronto, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what are those actual opportunities? And then how do you position yourself in a way? How do you meet the person that can get you to that next person who can get you to that person that you need to meet? Those were sort of some skills that I learned a little bit later. And functionally, I was just really lucky because some of those connections were a little bit easier just based on who my colleagues were at school. And they had already sort of crafted some pipelines or met some people and were happy to introduce me to them along the way, which was really beneficial for sort of like my early career growth. And then the other side of it too is I think I sort of, after, I think by the time I was at Rugby Canada, I kind of realized I wanted to get exposure to a bunch of different areas within sports. I'd had, this incredible experience on the at 2 brands with Red Bull and Adidas, and then I had an opportunity to go work for Rugby Canada on the property side. And then I sort of was like, okay, well, this agency thing seems to be that next piece that's probably missing from my resume. So got that experience, and then eventually over to MLSE, and then now working on sort of, Twitter's a weird one because we're kind of in this like technology, but we also kind of operate as like a rights distributor, but also a platform. So kind of in that weird like Rogers and CBC and Bell, and then you also have like us and Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, et cetera, in this like weird sort of like technology / broadcaster section. So that's kind of like where I currently play. But getting that exposure across all of the different pillars within the sports industry was something that I really craved. And I was really comfortable with the idea of a bunch of short-term career moves. And I was really comfortable with the idea of like contract work and getting to work internationally. I mean, I'll make no bones about it. I'm really fortunate. I had a family system that allowed me to sort of take some of those chances. And I'm super fortunate to have had that opportunity. But yeah, it meant for like the first few years of my career, it was a little bit less, didn't always know when the next job was coming around or where you were going to be living 6 months from now. And fortunately for me, I have now a fiance that was very, very willing to hang around and wait and sort of see where the chips fell. And it seems to have panned out.
Yeah, no, for sure. I have like three things I'd like to touch on. So maybe I'll go one at a time and then maybe we'll go on from there. But you're kind of mentioning how, early on what really helped you was, without even realizing, was the connections and network you were making, right? And even the mentors you had. But a lot of people that are listening, right, are, university students, either just starting or either just finishing. So that's kind of the sweet spot we have for the people listening. What kind of advice would you kind of give to them in regards to, hey, how do you start doing those initial connections or growing that network or even kind of getting those mentors as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I sort of have fallen into mentorship in a lot of interesting ways. Like I've made connections with people and then sort of like kept following up. I think when you're looking for a mentor, that's probably one of the most rewarding things. If someone's willing to be your mentor, it's probably one of the most rewarding things for that person taking the sort of like more typical mentor role, because it means there's someone who's inherently so interested in you as a person. They want to spend time learning specifically from you. And that comes with a whole host of expectation on the side of the mentee to make sure that you're not only valuing that person's time, but you're also adding value. So I've got the great fortune. I work with I've got 4 or 5 different mentors that I lean on anytime that I have like a big career change or something that's important. How do I structure this? How do I handle this? I probably talk to them less now than I used to. Just as you get sort of older in your career, you see a little bit more of the same experiences over and over again, and you kind of realize how to structure them. But when you're in that early stage of your career, having a confidant that you can talk to about, hey, I just got my first job offer. What should I do? How do I negotiate a salary? Hey, my boss is being an absolute dick. How do I respond to this? All those questions that you kind of don't feel comfortable talking to someone at your work. That's what that role of a mentor can take, alongside the whole, tell me the ins and outs of this career path. Who should I be talking to about X, Y, and Z? They also obviously do that side of it. But I think if you're actively looking for a mentor and actively looking for someone to help shape your career, I think good mentors never really give direction, but they try to ask insightful questions that help you sort of like lead you to a direction that you were probably naturally heading, or help shape you away from an opportunity. That's to be one thing I will say is a good mentor also usually will say if you're going down the wrong path, they'll usually throw the stoplight on. But other than that, it's a lot of reaching out and it's a lot of cold calling. I think the worst thing you can get in a response is a no, or just more typically the absolute no response, which I think we're all totally used to. Don't worry, I still get them to this day. And that's totally fine. Not everyone has time and not everyone has capacity. I think when you're in the university stage of your career, you kind of think that following up is bad, but in reality, so many people get so many emails that like following up on an email a lot of the time helps showcase and brings it to people maybe in a time frame where they're more susceptible to actually responding. But the other piece is just, if you're going to send out a LinkedIn notification or a LinkedIn message or a Twitter DM, try to come in with like a little bit of like something that's specific to the person. Why are you interested in meeting them? What about their career interests you? Why do you want to have that coffee chat? And do not ask for a job. If you ask for a job, you'll get advice. If you ask for advice, you'll get a job. It's no two bones about it. Any person who reaches out to me trying to get a job at Twitter, candidly, your DM, your LinkedIn message typically doesn't get a response to. If you just want to chat, want to learn more, there's a reason for us to chat, I'm usually pretty game. But the general just spam, find a million people in my network, add them all on LinkedIn, you're not usually going to make a bunch of hugely beneficial connections in the long run. So trying to spend that sort of 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes to figure out what that hook is, why you want to talk to that person, and then include that in your message, because it goes a lot longer of a way.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, especially for, like I said earlier, just kind of thinking about maybe 18-year-old Chris, right? When I was like, oh, hey, like accounting, I was never really networking. So I'm like, everyone needs an accountant, right? And then when you kind of go into sports, so many people, it's such a high demand industry, right? We're like, oh wow, like you actually need to be much more progressive. I don't know if that's the best word, but like you have to be agile, right? You have to be moving around. You can't just be on a standstill. And that's kind of one of the things they're talking about, right? If you're going to send someone a Twitter DM or LinkedIn or email, they're receiving a bunch of different requests, right? Hey, can you chat to me, or can you give me advice or a job, etc. And it's really kind of finding the way of how to stand out, right? And thankfully, I think this podcast was a good way when I first graduated on how to make connections. But no, it's definitely a useful advice that I think even when I chat to students, or even when I look back at myself, I'm like, wow, I got lucky with that. So I definitely see the value in that as well.
Being proactive is really good. And I would also say, like, I think there's a misconception amongst a lot of students that they can't provide value early in their career.
Mm-hmm.
It's a relationship where it's exclusively one way, where the person who has the job and who has the career and all that stuff is just providing value, sort of just in one direction. And the reality is at the beginning of a relationship, a lot of the time that's the case. But like as a relationship develops, it truly becomes a two-way street, and people are adding value both ways. And as silly as it sounds, I think we look back to like a lot of the advice we get from those career counselors or professors, where it's like, send that person 3 months later that you read it. I'm at Twitter. You read an interesting article about sports on Twitter. Send it to me. Even if I've read it, even if I don't care, even if I don't even barely read your email because my email's slammed, I at least got that email and I saw that you made the effort, that you cared enough to send me a note about it. And so that next time when you want to grab a coffee or whatever, I'm significantly more inclined to either help you or whatever, just because you've at least put the effort into a relationship and you're looking to add value to the relationship in a meaningful way. And you can do that at any stage of your career. It's not something that's exclusive to once you've sort of got your feet under your ground or feet on the ground, and you have like a role that you're sort of able to talk about.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that you're saying right there, because that's something I've always heard, right? Whether it's in school or even afterwards, where they're like, oh, the question is, hey, how do you stay in contact, right, with all these people? Where you're just gonna be like, hey, how's your weekend? Or you want something more meaningful, right? And providing that value, as you're saying, to have that two-way street. And I always found in regards to people are like, oh, just send an article they think would be relevant to them. And I like the perspective you kind of provided there, where it's like, hey, even though they are slammed, it's more so the action is going further, right, than actually having them read it and kind of having a full-on discussion. Like, oh yeah, I love this piece in the article, or talking about this quote, but just more so the action. So that's a great perspective to show. And another thing I want to kind of touch on before we kind of go back more into your route was in regards to, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't know if I wrote this down fully correctly, but you're saying, how do you meet people to get into the positions that you want? So I thought that was very unique because,
Sure.
I what I've heard recently is more people of, hey, the first position or first few jobs you get, you should be like, hey, how can this position help me grow, right? Rather than be like, oh, I want to go work for the Yankees or the Senators or whatever. But then that's kind of a little different, whereas how do you meet people to get maybe the job you want or the role you want? And do you maybe mind touching on that? Because that's something I haven't heard so far.
Yeah. I think it's the sort of super localized example I can give is like someone who's working for the Ottawa 67s probably knows someone who's working for the Sens, who probably knows someone who's working for the Red Blacks. And so if you've got that connection to the 67s, and that's like how you're going to play that little ladder game of like getting to that next person, getting to that next person, getting to that next person. That's the way of doing it. And I think what was really fortunate about my career is I was able to sort of make these kind of like 3,000 kilometer jumps with trying to find someone at Adidas in Germany, or trying to find someone at Red Bull in Taiwan. And I had, Red Bull in Taiwan. Okay. So I contact my manager, who's the Red Bull in Vancouver. So she's got the local or the global database. And so she just sends a blind email to what we called an FMS in Taiwan and in Taipei, and said, hey, like, one of my employees is coming to town. Like, he'd love to just get out and visit and meet with the team there, and go check out the office. And then one thing turns into another, and then you're helping out with projects on the side there. So trying to figure out what that sort of ladder of meet X person, get to Y person, meet Y person, get to Z person along the way, and how you get there. It's an art form that we can sort of do now with the help of like social networks. That's a hugely important thing. And what we've seen is like our networks are becoming a lot more international. I think someone in my role or your role, we've got a lot more contacts in the US than the people who were in our roles 20 years ago ever did. US, Europe, et cetera, that we can bounce ideas off of that are sort of outside of the normal. Like, there's not a lot of reason for me to know someone at the New York Jets. Like, I work for Canada, I'm Twitter Canada. The NFL doesn't have a Canadian team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They obviously have a massive presence in Canada, but all those things. But yet there's people there that I've had the opportunity to meet with and chat with and stuff like that. So that's, I think, what this opportunity of like trying to find that if your goal is to meet X person, how are the steps you're going to get there? Break it down, because sometimes that goal is seemingly super unattainable at the outset. But once you sort of figure out, well, if I meet X, then go to Y, and then go to Z, you can get there pretty easily.
Yeah, no, that when you explain it like that makes like a ton of sense, right? Where I find naturally sometimes in my career where, this person knew this person, they kind of just referred me, and just, that's a cool way to flow through making a network. But in regards to how you're living out with, in regards to the 67s, the Senators, and I don't know, the NHL, that's kind of unique, where I'm sure that's something that people are going to be scribbling down, just like I was just there to hey, I got to add that to my toolbox. But no, that's unreal. And I guess kind of going back to your route, right? You're talking about your position. You went to Adidas, went all the way to Germany. So I may be talking about that experience because, I'm sure there's people listening, right? We're in a position like, okay, I'm graduating. I have my BCom. I have my sports marketing master's, I guess is what it's called, etc. And, let's say Toronto, it's full. There's so many applicants. There's, maybe not really a hole for me to fill in this market, but I still want to work in sports. What's something you can kind of touch on in regards to your experience in going to Germany and working for Adidas? Because that's quite the leap, right? Where, I'm sure that's very nerve-wracking when you're used to being, at home, let's say if it's Toronto or something.
Sure. Yeah. I think fortunately for me, I've had a lot of international sort of experience early in my career, just like courtesy of exchanges. So the idea of moving abroad was something I was actively seeking versus something that sort of like kind of like was the opportunity that presented itself. And I think a lot of the time, if that's what you're looking for, if you're looking for that international exposure and international experience, like it's got to be something that you're actively seeking, because there's the whole process of finding a job in a market that you're not in is incredibly difficult. Where Adidas became this interesting piece was when you look at Germany as a country, they had this program called the Working Holiday Visa Program. And Canada has, I think, like 30, maybe 40 of these programs around the world, where as a sort of under 30 or under 35-year-old, it's very easy for you to go work in X other country. So for instance, as a Canadian, really difficult for you or I to work in the US. We have to get one of the like H-1B, TN visa, or you can get the Genius visa if you're a professional athlete, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like by and large, Chris and Conor want to work in the US, like it's probably going to be pretty difficult for us to happen. But you want to go work in Germany, you want to go get a 6-month contract in Germany, it's actually surprisingly easy to do, just based on the availability of a visa. Because I think we've all done that process of applying for a job, and then they always have that tick box of like, are you legally entitled to work in this country? And if you do those research on things like working holiday visas and those like what they call visa schemes, it becomes really easy to be like, oh yeah, like when I did my application for Adidas in Germany, it was like, yeah, I am legally applicable. It's a 6-month contract. I was allowed to be there for 6 months. So I was legally applicable. I checked the box and it was really not an issue. Then when they actually sent me the offer, they're like, just wanted to confirm, like, we're not going to give you any support. I was like, yeah, I think I said I already had the visa, but I just like was waiting to apply because it was like $250. So a little white lie there, but it wasn't an issue. So it was easy enough to get. So basically I think the moral of the story there for someone who is looking for that international experience is like, find the markets where it's your passport isn't an issue. Find the markets where it's really easy for you to find that opportunity where you don't pose this whole HR issue, because it's so hard to hire someone, especially early in your career, and it's so hard to justify like the legal and paperwork costs if you're early in your career looking for a job internationally.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, because just in regards to saying this sort of, checking off the box, hey, are you legally allowed to work in this country, or a visa applicable? I know when I I spoke to someone as soon as I graduated, and they're like, "Yeah, you know what? It may seem daunting, but I applied to 100 different positions in sports just to see what sticks and wherever." So I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna do that too." They told me 100, so I'm like, "Let me do it." So I created an Excel sheet. Shout out the accounting background, and then kind of filed all the different locations, and I was applying to Austria, California, obviously Canada, and those are kind of the questions coming up, right? They're like, "Hey, visa or X, Y, Z," and yeah, no, that's interesting because that's something that's always been in the back of my mind in regards to, you're young or whatever. It'd be always cool to, work in Germany because there's just in regards to the landscape of sport there is so different, right? Where we've had someone from, Bundesliga come on the podcast and they're talking about how they're in partnerships, but, the team's playing a relegation game. And if they win, fantastic. They stay in the Bundesliga, lots of budget. If they lose, basically everyone loses their job. So even though sport is so much more over there, and sometimes where it's in regard to the game is so impactful on their lives, right? Where it's very different sometimes to compared to the US and Canada. So that's interesting. I'd love to hear more about that one day. Yeah, and then I guess when you from there, if I'm not mistaken, you came back to Canada, went to Rugby Canada, right, as you were mentioning. So do you mind maybe touch on once you left Germany and came back to Canada, what were those positions like, and what were the reasonings of, hey, Rugby Canada, I learned this, and then I decided to go Momentum, and how did that kind of go?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I came back from Adidas, moved back to Vancouver, moved back home with my parents, and was like basically just trying to find a job. I feel like that's like everyone understands that. But I also was considering going to do my MBA in sports business down in Oregon. It's sort of like it was probably one of the clearest pipelines to get a job at Adidas in the US, which seemed to make a lot of sense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I applied. I actually ended up getting into Oregon and thought I was going to potentially go to get my MBA down there. And essentially it came back with this choice of kind of happening at the same time. Should I go do my MBA at Oregon, or should I move to Toronto, work for Rugby Canada? And I ended up going the Rugby Canada route as opposed to doing my MBA. And the reasoning why was nothing short of Oregon, because it's a phenomenal school and I really loved the opportunity that it presented and sort of all the things that could have happened. But I think where I was in my life, being a Canadian, trying to get a job in the US after I would graduate, there wasn't a level of certainty in terms of like that whole visa process. And it's not something that Oregon can ever control because obviously it's kind of like immigration that you're dealing with. And so with that in mind, I wanted the security of a little bit more certainty as to where I was going to live. And also, I mean, I had at the time a girlfriend that we'd been dating for multiple years at that point. So it was pretty serious. And so the idea of moving to the US was very much a us decision, not a me decision. And so she never held me back, but I think we both knew that our lives were probably going to be in Canada. So going to the US to go get an MBA at the time didn't seem to make as much sense as moving to Toronto and working for Rugby Canada. So got an opportunity, to go work for Rugby Canada leading into the Rugby World Cup, which was super interesting. I moved to Toronto and I didn't realize I'd been to Toronto like maybe once in my life beforehand for I think a weekend. So I lived in Toronto, but was working in Richmond Hill and did not realize how far away those two places were when I first moved here. And I think my first day of work, I had a 2.5 hour bus ride / TTC / YRT to get to work. Luckily, on my first day, I met someone from Toronto, so I was able to carpool with her going forward. But yeah, it was a really cool experience. I mean, one of the hardest things to do in sports marketing is to promote and to work with sports that sort of that get an underrepresented size of the budget. Be no bones about it, NSOs do not have the same sort of budgets that some of the major league teams do. And so what you can do with less is always an interesting thing, because you also usually can kind of get more from specific things. It's a little bit easier to utilize your athletes when you're working for an NSO than maybe you are when you're working for an NHL team, for instance. And stuff like that. And they're just hugely different. So it's a really cool, different level of experience to get. And I got to learn from some great people and got to work with some great people there, and work for sort of a cause that was really something I was passionate about. And then I moved over to Momentum, working on that team, trying to sort of work for a traditional agency. And I was working on MasterCard, which was a business run by the traditional agency side, so the McCann side. But I was specifically working on their sponsorship and experiential side, which is under the McCann World Group, is the momentum side. So kind of like wearing two hats at the same time, just based on the business. And I got to probably learn my most impactful marketing, like how to be a good marketer. That's probably where I learned it the most in my career, how to write a brief. That's like one of the skills that I got from that experience that I think I carry to this day. How to actually combine two brands in a meaningful way from a sponsorship. They have differing objectives. They have differing brand guidelines. They have differing what they're trying to do. How do we make it all work together? And that was something that I got from that experience. And again, I got to work with some amazing people, and then sort of grew in that role. I ended up actually getting promoted while I was there, which was awesome. And then took that next step over to MLSE thereafter.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to write all this stuff down because there's so many things I always forget to ask sometimes. So I try to write it down whenever I can. And yeah, it's pretty interesting because I feel like I've mentioned this in one of the recent podcasts now. So if I'm repeating myself for those listening, I guess that's too bad. But in regards to what you're saying, working for the NSOs, that's something that I think someone mentioned to me about a year ago, right? Where, they're saying how, yes, it would be cool to work for, let's say, the Yankees, but you would learn so much more if the example they're using for me, because, Canadian love hockey, they're saying going to the UK and working for an elite ice hockey league team, which only has like a staff of 4 people. And they're really trying to grow the sport there because, soccer, rugby, even cricket are so much larger there. They're saying that's where you'd really end up learning, skill sets, right? To, maybe not so much as an agency, but in regards to actual problem solving, right? So that was kind of the difference they're saying for me. And like you're saying, that's probably relevant in Canada in regards to the NSOs that don't get as much funding as, these bigger teams or leagues. So that's interesting as well. And then while you were talking about your momentum, position, you said 2 things, or you said one thing in particular that kind of struck me. You're like, I learned how to be a good marketer. So do you mind maybe sharing, what did you learn? What could you share that along those lines? Like the 3 things you're like, this is what makes you a good marketer.
Yeah, for sure. I think the strength of a good marketer is a few things. I think when I was at Momentum, I got an opportunity to learn what, like, I guess I'll backtrack a little bit. What's really prided in a lot of advertising agencies is to write a brief with as few words as possible on it, with the least amount of words as possible. And the reason for that is the more you can shape a sandbox without sort of shaping a sandbox creates the biggest amount of creativity. And so if you can tell someone, hey, like, this is our budget, this is the money we have, and this is when we need to launch because of X, Y, Z and reasons, and this is the insight that we want to sort of like build a campaign around, and you can kind of leave it at that, you'll always be more amazed with what you come back with versus if you try to be hyper directive as to where they're going to take an idea. And why that's important, and where sort of I learned that on that side of the coin, working on the agency side, was just like, so often what is right for a brand may not be what seemingly is right from the get-go. And a really good agency has the trust of the brand partners that they're working with to sometimes direct them in a way that they weren't thinking, or to sometimes tell them that, hey, like, you should actually be looking at it this way, or thinking about it this way. Because candidly, as a marketer, so often we do so much to impress other marketers that we forget that we actually need to service like the clients that or the people that potentially will buy our product. Because there's nothing worse than marketers talking to marketers, and we need to talk to the people that actually functionally matter to our campaigns. So I think what I learned was just like, you have resources at your disposal when you work in an agency. You've got creative teams, you've got strategy teams, et cetera, and you can shape the business in a positive way or negative way. And the relationships that you build amongst those teams allow you the leeway to sort of bend but not break in different directions. And that's hugely beneficial. But what it all comes down to, and it all came down to me, is like, make sure you understand the why of why you're doing something. And like, have an insight, and why is the strategy and the plan that you're recommending, why does it make sense? Understand that, and be able to sell that through, because if you can understand the why, that's how you can communicate it outwardly, whether you're communicating it back to your brand partners, whether you're communicating it back to the end consumer, et cetera, et cetera. Like the why is hugely important. And there's lots of people that get paid a bunch of money to figure out the why. So if you're not leveraging what they're figuring out, then you're kind of, and you're sort of trying to like impose something that that you think is just right. Like that's not doing a good service to your sort of brand partners, nor to their end consumers.
Yeah, no, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, no, I'm just trying to write that. Yeah, so I guess as you're kind of, going through all these different positions, and it's something maybe that we kind of touched on,
Sure.
Your network, right? And maybe the mentors and the connections you made, that's kind of the core theme of it, right? But I know maybe a question that's coming to mind for people listening, even sometimes myself, is, people hop from all these different positions and, kind of climb the ladder or, grow within their career. But the question is, hey, how did you go from, I know you're saying when you came back from Adidas, you were applying to positions. So I'm assuming Rugby Canada was from an application. But in regards to Momentum, MLSE, and then Twitter, how did those positions come about? Were you applying as well? Were you maybe referred? Do you mind maybe sharing that portion?
Yeah, Twitter was the first role I'd like to say like got on my own merit. The other ones have all been, whether it was some sort of a connection or someone within my network that recommended I apply to a role, or someone who sort of helped lead a warm introduction. I mean, unfortunately, I remember I was part of the hiring process for a role when I was at MLSE, and like if you want to work on the GP team at MLSE, that's one of the most desirable jobs in sports in Canada. And I remember, I think for one of the jobs, we only had the application open for like 3 days, and we had, I think, over 600 or 700 applicants. And
Wow.
the job was open for like 3 days. And that's just like the level of the competition. That's how hungry the environment is. And so you can imagine how hard it is to stand out without some sort of like a recommendation or a referral or some sort of eluding conversation that you work into. And one of the things that I was actually really proud of is at MLSE, they sort of tried to remove that bias. So they stopped allowing those coffee chats before an interview and stuff like that, which I think is really beneficial to sort of make sure that you have the most deserving applicants getting into that next stage in the hiring process. But I think for me, I was super fortunate in the fact that like a lot of the time throughout my career, I've either had someone who helped direct me to whether it's a mentor which was the case for the Momentum role, who helped get me in line to the role that I ended up getting to there, or MLSE. I'd been working with some lovely people there for about 3.5 years, who when there was an opening said, hey, you should apply. And then MLSE, and then Twitter was just simply I think a headhunter or like an internal recruiter reached out saying, your resume fits this role. We'd love for you to apply. And I guess they liked me because they ended up choosing me.
No, yeah, of course. And I guess before we kind of get into your Twitter position, because obviously I want to dive more deeper into those compared to the others.
Sure.
Do you want to maybe touch on, your role at MLSE and global partnerships? Because as you said, very competitive role, 3-day, application, period, and 600, 700 people applied to that. So do you mind maybe sharing what that position is like? I guess that's as simple as I can.
Totally. Yeah, it's I love to say it's like working at GP at MLSE is kind of like working in investment banking at Goldman, and the fact that it's this badge of honor that no one can ever take away from you. Like you've worked for probably the top property in Canada on a team that brings in hundreds of millions of dollars in sponsorships. Like that's huge. They're like, that's a highly efficient, highly organized. The amount of assets that they sell, the amount of partners that they have, the amount of open categories that they manage to fill on an annual basis with these incredible deals is just honestly astounding. And it's a great place to learn the people managers and the relationship and soft skills that they sort of help their employees develop, especially from an early stage in their career, is really, really beneficial. You can see the people that have been there for a decade plus, like they are some of the most powerful people within the sports industry in Canada, by nature of just simply that system that's built around them creates and fosters this incredible ability to make the right connections within the Canadian sort of sports marketplace and all the potential advertisers and whatnot. And then you also get the exposure to so many sports, right? Because you're working across hockey, basketball, football and soccer. So you've got so much opportunity to sort of see all these different areas. So it's a hugely unique experience just based on like the reach that MLSE has, and also the prominence that they have within like the Canadian sports landscape. They're really, really unique in terms of the outsized importance that they have within sort of a national landscape. Because I think even when you look at the US, there's not that same level of sort of like one holding company that really owns the marketplace in the same way that MLSE owns the marketplace in Canada. And so being a part of that is really cool. There's I can tell you getting to be in the building for opening night after the Raptors championship, watching the players get their rings. I unfortunately started a little bit too late, so I didn't obviously get a part of that. But like getting to see all my colleagues get their rings that morning was a really, really cool, exciting day. Getting to be there on opening night of the Leaf season. There's like a few traditions, and one of the ones is everyone wears their fanciest suit that day. If you work on that team, and everyone's in the building and all your partners are in the building, and it's a really, really cool environment. So honestly, a great place to learn how to be a good relationship person, and also just to also be a good marketer, because so much of that role is problem solving, and kind of in a lot of ways you end up trying to build a plane while you're flying it, and also manage these really important relationships.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And personally, there's a lot of questions. Maybe I'll ask you that another time. One of the things the last thing I'll ask in regards to MLSE before we kind of get into your role at Twitter is, so I'm assuming a lot of people listening, our biggest demographic in Canada is obviously Toronto. So I'm sure people listening have probably applied to a position at MLSE at some point. What advice would you give to someone listening trying to be one of those 600 people to get an interview?
The 600 people don't get an interview, but of the people that do, yeah. That would be a busy couple of weeks.
Crazy, yeah. That'd be a whole year.
But yeah, I think there's a great expression I've been told, which is like your network is your net worth. And so trying to establish who those people are. You never want to meet someone when you need them is probably the easiest way to think about it. So if you have an interest in working at MLSE one day, and maybe it's something you want to do now, maybe it's something you want to do in 2-3 years, in the same way that you might have an interest in working at Twitter, or the same way that you might have an interest in working at Rogers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, like trying to meet those people that might be helpful in terms of helping you get ready for those interviews, or helping potentially sort of give you a positive look in or referral within the application process. Having that sort of in your back pocket now is really helpful. I can tell you, like the few folks that I have the really good fortune to help from a sort of like a mentorship capacity, they've put in the time. And so when they ask for something, it's really easy for me to sort of either recommend them or connect them to someone, because candidly, like I know that they're going to put on a good face, and I know that I'm going to be seen as really positive, having introduced this person or recommended this person for a role or whatnot. So try to sort of do that work before you ask for it, because I can tell you, when a job gets posted, if you work on the GP team and a job gets posted in GP at MLSE, your LinkedIn blows up with people sort of looking for that edge, as everyone does. But it really stands out if you've done that work sort of before the application process opens, and you've done those little things to have a couple coffees beforehand or whatnot, and you've feigned an interest in who they are and their career path in advance of just sort of like, hey, this job opened up, I'd like to talk to you about it, because those are two different conversations.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And then I guess one question I have, kind of just building off one of the things you said, is in regards to, your network is your net worth. I've heard that a few times as well. And obviously you've touched on, doing the work beforehand, right, before you actually need it. Are there any other things that you would maybe suggest in regards to building that strong network that, increases your net worth, right? Whether it's, you kind of touched on earlier about, hey, it can be as simple as, let's say for you, sending you an article in regards to Twitter sports, right? And just showing that action. Or are there other things that kind of come to mind? Because, even sometimes I'll say, even in regards to myself, I think I've been fortunate to meet like amazing people from this podcast, but sometimes it's super hard in regards to just keep in touch with everyone, because there's a new guest every week, and what can I say in a timely period, right? That still allows me to kind of maintain that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I get like the easy company plug here, which is like Twitter's a great place for that sort of connection. There's a
Yeah.
great sponsorship community and sports community on Twitter, and
Mhm.
it's probably where I've made a lot of the better connections in my career. I will always say, and it's no fault of LinkedIn because it's a phenomenal platform and it's something I've used, but I've made some really impactful connections on Twitter, and personally for myself probably more, and that's goes along with being the guy that works at Twitter. More so on Twitter, it's been the most powerful social networking platform for me in my career in terms of finding the right people and connecting with them. Because the other side of it too is you get to when you follow someone on Twitter, you kind of get to see who they are as a whole person. And I've got a bunch of friends that, on the outside, they may just be someone who works at XYZ company, but I find on Twitter, oh, like they're a Raptors fan. Oh, they're a sneakerhead. Oh, they're into finance Twitter. These are similarities we share. And so next time when we're talking, it's not always, oh, tell me about your, what's new with your role. It's like, oh, I saw your dog. So cute, blah, blah, blah. This is what my dog's like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
And because, like, I mean, I'm always happy to talk about sports. I'm always happy to talk about Twitter, but there's also an opportunity where it's like, oh, you're a massive skier? Cool. Well, I grew up in Whistler. Like that's a ski haven. Like, let's talk a little bit about that. Have you had the opportunity to ski there?
Mhm.
And so finding those areas outside of the typical business speak, because yes, 100%. Sending an article to someone, hugely valuable, shows you care, shows you're invested in the relationship. And it's a bunch of work to stay invested in those relationships. And it's not easy, not at all. But you also need to figure out which relationships you want to keep sort of closer to the fire and which relationships you're okay with having them drift away. Because we only have 24 hours in the day. You only have you have the same amount of time in the day as Beyonce, and you got to make that work one way or the other. So
That's good.
whether that's, you have I've got, I think, 5 mentors that I keep in touch with. And I've got a few people that like at one point were really, really close to me, and really, really valuable to me as mentors that sort of, I shouldn't say aren't mentors anymore, but I just don't reach out to as much because
Mhm.
they're the opportunity or the information I can glean from some of the other mentors, I feel might be a little bit more applicable. So I spend a little bit more time with those mentors than I do with the others. And that's a conscious decision that I think you should make, but there's also connections that you make that you may not talk to them for 2 years, and then there's a reason to catch up and you do, and it's great. And I think people also recognize that. People also aren't offended a lot of the time if you don't reach out for a couple of years, but you find a reason to reconnect, and that's okay too. So finding reasons to reach out is great. They don't always have to be super, super professional. Sometimes you just need to talk about other stuff, and that's totally fine too. We're normal people. We all have lives outside of work too, right?
100%. And that's probably the thing with me, right? Where I think even in regards to school or even sometimes, I think I'm a pretty well-rounded person where I hate just always talking about work or kind of being like, oh, hey, did you see this article? That's not who I am as a person, right? I enjoy, going and playing sports or traveling and stuff. And that's where I find some of the connections I've made like the best. Was even one recently. We were just talking about football before the podcast for 30 minutes. And then, now we message back and forth in regards to that stuff. Right. So I definitely see that. And another shout out to, Twitter, I guess. Some of my best guests have come from Twitter, whether it's just, you talked about that flow chart of, 67 senators, NHL. I find Twitter is like a great way to do that digitally, or sometimes I've connected with someone, I don't know, in esports. Then I met someone else, and then I met someone else, and then just from the following and then interacting with them and going from there. And it's definitely the social platform since the pandemic has taken place that I've kind of gone on to more. I don't know why, if it's just kind of the reading the articles or the tweets, and that's something that I'm enjoying more now as I'm getting older. As awkward as it is to say, but I definitely need to see it. That's one of the things it's actually on my to-do list up here is like get involved in Twitter more. But
Love it.
yeah.
Honestly, I think you're one of the things that I think people have found a lot of value in is you can find these people that you inherently look up to on Twitter who maybe have that job that you one day want, or they are just an interesting individual within an industry that you care about, and you can connect with them really easily. The worst thing that happens is you respond to one of their tweets and they don't reply back. But a lot of the
Yeah.
times they will, because like if you provide an interesting point of view or you ask them a question, like it's number one, everyone wants to clear that little one beside their notifications. And number two, it's like it's a super I guess the word's not impersonal, but it's a super casual way to like connect with someone. And you can connect with them from like their professional thoughts, but you can also connect with them in an interesting way. Like I got great friends where, like I just talked to them about their dogs. titans of the sponsorship industry. We talk about
Yeah.
dogs.
Yeah. No, of course that makes sense. And to be honest, some of my best connections, even in regards to that I have on Twitter that I like enjoy. I don't interact enough, but when I see their posts that I like, reading, or people that are talking about, their sneakers, because my first year of university, that was a big hefty expense for me, right, in regards to sneakers. So or even just in regards to playing video games, because I find everyone does that now. But no, I definitely see that as well. Actually, you know what? On that note, I think you touched on when you were talking about Adidas earlier, and then we'll get into Twitter after this. You're a huge sneakerhead when you're a kid, or
Yeah,
when you're
still am.
younger?
Still
Still
am.
am.
Still am.
What's your go-to or top three, if you don't mind me asking?
What do I wear?
Well, top three. Yeah, let's go with what you wear. Or what top three shoes that you like?
Those are two different questions, but I'll start with
Yeah,
top
yeah.
three that I wear. Levi's Jordan 4s, Jordan 1 Shadows, and then in the summertime I wear Reebok. There's a pair of Reeboks that never released in Canada. They only released like one store in the US. The Reebok Fury Lights, and they're a collaboration with a Japanese store called Mastermind. But you don't have to wear socks with them. And so that's why I wear them in the summertime, because they're a sockless shoe and there's like no laces, so you can just slip them on and they're really easy.
So you got the Levi 4s?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's impressive. And what, do you use GOAT or something, or you just have a store in Toronto?
When we had the Jordan store, I was super fortunate because I lived about a block away. So it was, people would camp out overnight, and I was functionally able to wake up at 6 a.m., brush my teeth, jump in the shower, and show up near the end of the line. And usually was pretty okay with getting some stock. So the Levi's, I think I actually ended up buying from a friend.
Fair.
But yeah.
Okay, and then I guess just the last question in regards to, because it's two different questions. What are maybe your top three most grailed sneakers? It was like, I don't know, like three shoes that you're like trying to get.
That I'm trying to get? That's a good question. Okay, so I really want the band Jordan ones. I've never had bread Jordan ones, but I want the band ones with the red X on the back. Just because like that was like, I got into sneakers back when Bapes were big. And that was like one of the first ones where someone was like, oh, you got to like line up. And I was like, I don't want to line up for sneakers. That's ridiculous. And then now I'm like, that's super reasonable. I'll do that. I own probably another pair that I think I'm saving it for my wedding day is my JTH Jordan 3s, the ones from when Justin Timberlake came to Toronto. And just because like I showed up at like noon and they didn't release until like 6 p.m. and it was like a negative 20 day in Toronto, and I was standing outside and it was awful, but I was there with a friend, so it was so much fun. So I own those, but they were a grail for the longest time. And then again, another one that's like, sorry,
the white 3s with the swoosh, or are those the khaki ones?
Yeah, white 3s with the swoosh.
I had those.
Yeah, from the Super Bowl, from Super Bowl 50.
Those are good ones. Yeah,
those are great. And then the other pair that like I picked up a while ago, but I had been waiting for forever, were the Adidas Undefeated Bape ZX 5000s. They were like super hard to get, and they're super gaudy, and I still don't know why I love them so much, because they're so hard to wear with anything. But to this day, that was like one of my original, like, I need this pair, I need this. Like I have an undesirable need for this physical commodity. And once I got it, I've worn them so many times, and they never match with anything, but I love them so much.
Yeah, I think I had Undefeated 8s, and similar, like Ottawa. I think Ottawa is way colder than Toronto for some reason, even though it's just down the highway. I remember it was like negative 25. I went before work, which I was working outside later in the day as well at the stadium. And I got these green Jordan 8s, and I'm not the biggest guy in the world. And they're just like, I'd wear them around the house. I would just stand in front of the mirror wearing these shoes. I'm like, oh, these are unreal. And then my friends were like, oh, hey, let's go somewhere. And I'm like, okay, what can I wear to like go out with these shoes? And nothing works. So I had to sell them because it didn't make any sense, because I was never going to wear these green Jordans that just popped with their orange. But that makes sense. I guess getting back on track a bit, in regards to Twitter. So do you mind maybe explaining to us, what is this position like, right? Head of sports of Twitter. What can you share?
Yeah. So it's honestly, I think Twitter, people come to Twitter for a few things, right? Like they a lot of the time, like you said, like over the pandemic, you've been drawn more to Twitter. And people typically come to Twitter for news, they come to Twitter for entertainment, or they come to Twitter for sports. Like those are the three areas where I think we really punch above our weight. And that sports conversation is a lot of what I'm sort of worried about in Canada, for lack of a better expression. I shouldn't say worried, but what I'm focused on. And so when you think about that, that conversation is driven by a few things. It's driven by like the teams and leagues that create sport. It's driven by the broadcasters that own the rights to that sport, and it's also driven by the fans and the athletes that participate in that sport. And so my role is essentially to try to create the healthiest conversation about sports in Canada. And how do we do that is like the interesting piece is like, and that's a lot of working with what we like to call our publishing partners. So think about that as the broadcasters, the teams, the leagues, to bring the best content onto Twitter. Because if you're a sports fan and you see on Twitter, oh my God, did you see that crazy goal by Austin Matthews? Well, the first place that it's probably going to be published outside of on linear or on TV, I should say, where it just happened, is probably on Twitter. Someone's going to post it on Twitter. One of, Sportsnet or at Toronto Maple Leafs or at Maple Leafs is going to post it on Twitter. And that is what we can provide. Is we want to work with those publishing partners that we have to get them to bring those conversation starters and bring that conversation to Twitter, and find ways, candidly, for them also to be rewarded for that. So how do they monetize that content? How do they put that content in a way that they can, in the same way that they monetize their content on TV and digital with ads and stuff like that, how do they do that on Twitter? And then the other side of that is just the organic side of the platform. So how do we make Twitter a functionally positive place for our publishing partners, but also for athletes and also for fans? And what are we doing as a platform to make the environment better, or just do things that are what we like to say are good for Twitter? So like last year during the World Juniors, obviously no fans in the stadium. So we got to work with Hockey Canada to bring fan tweets inside the stadium. As the players are warming up, like instead of seeing like the typical maybe ad messages that they would have for like their corporate partners, well, there's no fans in stadium. So there's like really no value to those corporate partners to have those ads running in something that's not TV visible. So we use that space, and we were able to include like tweets from fans there. And that was just something that we didn't really make any money off of it, but it was like the cool, right thing to do that we got to do with a great publishing partner being Hockey Canada. And so we try to do more stuff like that to either help serve conversations or help serve underserved conversations. So we think about things like women's sport in Canada, diversity in sport in Canada, and more globally, and obviously not just limited to Canada, but obviously I'm pretty focused on our country specifically. So kind of those two sides of the coin. And then the last piece is obviously like when athletes have trouble with their accounts and stuff like that, or teams have trouble with their accounts, or checking out new products and stuff like that. I handle a lot of that as well.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, because now that you're kind of saying it out loud, I'm just thinking about it. Twitter is like, in regards to hockey, I'm a die-hard Sens fan. Anything regarding the Senators, I remember when Kachuk was waiting to sign, every day, in between meetings, I was always checking, the insiders to see what was new there. And like you said, right, I guess it was work from you, right, where in regards to, and your team, to always make sure that's kind of the first place for conversation, right? Because let's say something happened in the game in like preseason and I missed it because I went to go get a glass of water, and the first thing I was like, search it up on Twitter, and then boom, it was there. People are commenting on it. So yeah, hats off to you guys, because I see that even just regards to my fandom.
Well, thank you, but it's our partners, not us. We give them the sandbox. They're the ones that fill it up.
Yeah. You mentioned that earlier. That's good stuff. I do have a question in regards to that. That just kind of made me think. So in regards to, let's say, hockey, right? Huge topic in Canada, and as I was mentioning, these insiders in Canada, their news outlet, or their vehicle to kind of release their news, I should say, is Twitter. Is that something you guys kind of work with I don't know, TSN? Be like, hey, we'll help you, or even just kind of provide more. What is it? Not insight.
Support?
No, not support. What is it? More, not reason. I'm blanking on the words today.
Awareness, or
man, what is it? In regards to, so let's say someone like Bob McKenzie, right? The reason why you should post on Twitter versus another platform, we'd give you more whatever. I don't even know what the word is.
I think I know where you're going, but yeah. So like we work with, like when we say we work with the publishers, We're working with their talent teams, and we're working with sort of everyone from the sides of the business, the people that manage whether it's like the TSN accounts, the Sportsnet accounts, the CBC accounts, or their talent, and trying to find ways for their talent to utilize Twitter in a really positive and meaningful way. And I think what we've seen, and they're a lot of the time they pride themselves on who is first, and I think it's the benefit of us. The measure of who is first is the first person to talk about it on Twitter, and so we got to see this year during the expansion draft. I mean, unfortunately for Seattle, but every single one of their picks came out on Twitter like hours before the actual TV broadcast where they announced each of the picks, which was a really, really funny situation for us. And we saw it again. We saw it on the basketball side, going with every single one of the NBA draft picks in the first round was announced on Twitter before it was announced on broadcast. And so that's just kind of the power of the network and the power of the insiders across multiple sports. We see with Adam Schefter in the NFL, et cetera, et cetera. And so they see the superpower that Twitter has, and they see the audience that they can create by providing that value to their fans on Twitter, which is awesome. And they're a big part of the reason why people come to Twitter to follow the hockey conversation. Like, for sure, you want to see when Brady Tkachuk scores a goal, especially if you had to go get water. But you also want to know what's the latest of his contract situation on the middle of a day on a Tuesday. And you can kind of trust that that's going to happen. I mean, there's no day that's kind of as wild as trade deadline day in terms of how often people are like pressing F5 or scrolling down on their screen to refresh their tweets, just because you're a little bit worried. I think I'm probably a bigger basketball fan than anything else. And I remember last year on the NBA trade deadline day when the Kyle Lowry news, was he going to get traded? Was he not? And then he eventually didn't. And then there was the big sort of collective sigh of relief across Raptors fans across Canada. Like that's super normal. And we all sort of come and go to Twitter to get that information. So I think we're really happy that we get to play that role for fans and be that connective tissue between what's breaking and it's breaking on Twitter. But it's something that I think we need to continually make sure that our publishing partners and the people that are driving that conversation have the support so that they can continue to do that.
Yeah, no, for sure. That does make a lot of sense. And I guess one of the last questions I have before we wrap up with our two broad questions I ask everyone is in regards to, you kind of mentioned how one of your roles is kind of helping create a healthy conversation about sports in Canada. What kind of things you guys do? Because, sometimes social media can have such a negative, connotation, right? Or even just conversations. Are the things you guys kind of maybe, help maybe, drive certain conversations, maybe even in regards to, let's say, a sport, let's say basketball, for instance, rather than kind of showing, two guys maybe fighting or something, you guys are maybe more promoting or pushing the content of, hey, like a great play or something, or hey, Drake and, Kyle Lowry, dabbing up before the game. So that's something that you guys kind of do to maybe just make sure it's more of a positive environment rather than, negative.
Yeah, I think I think we're really specific about when we say the healthy public conversation, because sometimes conversation that's healthy can be sometimes inherently a little bit negative. And that's okay. The role we play is to be the healthy public conversation. Ideally, a lot of it is positive, and I think like the nice thing about sports is there is a lot of positive conversation there. But like that's not the world we live in. The world we live in is not rosy all the time. What we do in terms of helping sort of everyone within the sports ecosystem, but it's obviously not just restricted to sports, but my focus being sports is probably the one I'm most comfortable talking about, is making sure that everyone's held to the same sort of level of policy on a sort of everyday basis. And I mean, I think it's like I don't know the number, but I think it's thousands, tens of thousands, whatever it is, tweets per second, right? So trying to manage and monitor every single tweet is pretty difficult. But we've got a phenomenal policy team that does their work to make sure things that are when they happen that it shouldn't be on our platform get taken down for a variety of reasons. And there's a ton of reasons. And there's definitely, I think, room to grow. And I think our policy team is always ever changing in terms of what they're looking to do and what they're looking to change. But I'm really happy of the work that we've done to hopefully make it so that people who want to take part in the sports conversation in Canada know that Twitter's a place that they can do it. And that if nothing else, it's somewhere where the conversation is healthy. And they will always have sort of a policy team that they can at least go to and understand sort of why decisions have been made one way or the other.
Yeah, for sure. That makes total sense. And I guess the way to kind of wrap up the episode, I just have two questions I like to ask everyone. So we're going to jump into the future. 103-year-old Connor on a rocking chair, just thinking about your
Made it.
career. Right? Yeah, exactly. Is there maybe a moment in time in your career so far that has stood out? And you're going to be on that rocking chair, 130 years old. You're like, wow, I can't believe I got to do that for work.
Yeah, I did a campaign with Fred VanVleet when I was at MLSE called Fred Does ASMR. And it's a super weird campaign because ASMR is inherently weird, but Fred was the perfect athlete for it. The brief that I got from the partner, which was Canadian Tire, was really, really well written. And then I got to turn it into a really good creative brief. And then the team that we worked with at a company called VMG Productions did a phenomenal job coming back with a really, really innovative, fun, creative idea. And it came together really well, and it's something I'm super proud of. It ended up just winning an award at the SMCCs, so it's something that I sort of really enjoy getting to hang my hat on being a small part of.
Yeah, no, for sure. I saw that here on your LinkedIn, and it's funny enough that you mentioned it. But yeah, that's amazing, especially being such a big basketball fan as you're mentioning.
Totally.
Now, the last question, you kind of dropped little nuggets and insights throughout the podcast because that's what it's all about. But if we were to go back to 16, 18, 20-year-old Connor, right, and you were able to give him some type of insight regarding maybe life or career that now that you wish you did when you're kind of starting it all, what would you say?
Like other than buying Bitcoin, probably lead with that. I think I remember most major sporting events, so I'd probably try to download a lot of those and tell him to go to Vegas and bet on some sports. No, I think to the real answer of your question, I think I would try to remind him that you're gonna fail. You're gonna fail, and you're gonna fail a lot, and that's totally okay because everyone does. And it's sort of how you rebound from that and how you fail forward and how you fail quickly and all those things that really will define who you are as a person. And I think that's like I've been through points in my life where I was unemployed for like 6 months in between jobs, and that's totally normal. But people don't necessarily talk about it. People love to talk about like sort of the really positive parts of their life and their wins. So I think reminding myself or going back and being able to remind myself that you're gonna fail a lot, and that's okay.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree. Where sometimes I find even going on some of these social platforms, LinkedIn being one of them, where yeah, it's a great platform to connect professionally, but sometimes you go on there and you're like, wow, how is everyone doing so well, right? No one's really ever touching on how hey, I'm in between jobs, or hey, like this was difficult. It's more so, hey, like we just did this, or hey, we did this, or so I definitely appreciate whenever someone comes on, or even I have the opportunity to chat with someone. They get a little real, like, hey, you know what? This actually wasn't that easy, or this wasn't that great. I think that's where it kind of becomes more genuine. Like, okay, like this is someone who's like a real person I can actually learn from. So I
Totally.
agree with that, and would like to hear more. One question I do have on that, if you don't mind, you said failing forward. Do I maybe go into more explaining that a bit more? Kind of.
Yeah. Probably one of the best lunch chats I've ever had was with a guy named John Wexler, who now leads entertainment and influencer, I think, partnerships for Shopify. But he used to be entertainment influencer marketing for Adidas. And I got to meet him, and that's a story for another day about sort of like that whole route. But he did a TED Talk on all about failing. And this is probably one of the most successful people within that industry. Like he built the relationship with Kanye. He built the relationship with Pharrell and Beyonce and all these amazing, amazing people that ended up working with Adidas. And that his whole talk about how like he's got this entire conversation about how he sort of like had a concert back when he was when he was studying at University of Wisconsin. And it's a great TED Talk, but it sort of is all rooted in this idea of like you're gonna fail, it's okay. But failing forward means that like you're moving on and you're ready to sort of jump into that next challenge. Like don't stay in that space where you failed. Like that's going to happen. You're not going to win every time. No one goes 100 for 100. So just be ready to jump back and move on to the next thing when it's time.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and that's kind of describes the reason perfectly why I like ending with that question on the podcast, because I think it just caps it all and brings it all together perfectly. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Unless there's anything else you'd like to share, Probably the most notes I've ever taken in an episode. I got 2 pages here, so that's
Love
good
it.
stuff. But
That was
yeah,
awesome, Chris. Thanks so much for having me. It was an awesome time getting to chat with you.
perfect. Thank you so much.
Awesome.